peace. I am a man of peace, but when I speak, they are for war. As we face this era in the history of the Lord's Church in America, we're facing one of the most critical times, not only for God's people, but for all the people of America. The Kansas and Nebraska Act of 1854 had killed the Whig Party and gave birth to the Republican Party. In 1856, after the birth of the Republican Party, the first presidential candidate that was offered by the Republicans was a man by the name of John C. Fremont, and he was from the brand new state of California. In opposition to him was a man by the name of James Buchanan, a Democrat, who defeated Fremont, of course, for the presidency. But 4 years later, the people of America realized that democratic rule of those past 4 years was not going to solve, really, the strife in which the nation had fallen. As we've already referred, March 6, 1857, the Dred Scott decision was made by the Supreme Court, a Democratic-dominated Supreme Court at the time, taking away the rights of the Negro under the Constitution, offering him as simply chattel, in which any federal marshal or sheriff could go into any federal territory and bring back a slave and return him to his owner, regardless of whether it was a free state at the time or whether it was among those states that were considered the slave states in the country. In 1859, a man by the name of John Brown, who had, like the man Pardee Butler, the preacher in the Restoration Movement, had spent considerable time in Bleeding, Kansas, stirring up strife, fighting against the efforts there, trying to bring about what he considered the release of the Negroes, the abolition, and their freedom. And we'd like to consider that John Brown not only had his problems in Kansas, but he decided that he would lead an army and invade the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, West Virginia. And he did this in the year 1859. We have some slides that we'd like to share with you. I was born just a few miles from Harper's Ferry, West Virginia, maybe 30 miles from this place. And this is one of the most picturesque spots in the United States. I don't know if the slide does it justice, but the Shenandoah River flowing north through the Shenandoah Valley empties into the Potomac River right at this particular point. And the slide was taken from the top of the hill above the village of Harper's Ferry. It was here that John Brown made his raid. Let's have the next slide, please. These buildings that you see today in the downtown area of Harper's Ferry are part of a national park today. The whole town has been made into a national park. These buildings were standing when John Brown came to Harper's Ferry in 1859 and stood throughout the Civil War, of course, still there today. This particular building, I believe, plays an important role in the raid. Was the home of an important individual who lived here at the present time, now a historical building owned by the Parks Department. And this was John Brown's fort. Really, this is where he was held up and surrounded by federal troops, which were led by a colonel in the United States Army at that time. His name was Robert E. Lee. Later, just a year or two later, became a general and the leader of the Confederate forces. And I believe this home here, likewise, played an important role. It was here at Harper's Ferry that, of course, John Brown was captured and later hung. And as the Civil War progressed, the Union forces went marching off to war singing, "John Brown's body lies a molding in the grave, but his soul goes marching on." In the election of 1860, there were 4 candidates and 4 political parties. The Democrats met in convention and nominated as their candidate Stephen A. Douglas. The Southern Democrats bolted the party because of Douglas's previous compromises on the slavery issue, and met in Tennessee and appointed John C. Breckinridge as their party candidate. Abraham Lincoln became the candidate of the Republican Party. And there was a Constitutional Union Party which was endeavoring to make peace and hold the country together, and they nominated a man by the name of John Bell. The popular vote went like this. Abraham Lincoln only received 40% of the popular vote in the year 1860, while 29% of it went to Stephen A. Douglas, 18% to John C. Breckinridge, and 13% to John Bell. Abraham Lincoln, however, received 180 votes in the Electoral College and was elected president. On December 20th, 1860, before Abraham Lincoln, after his election, before he was actually inaugurated, South Carolina, because of the defeat of the Southern candidate, decided on immediate cessation from the Union. And within 6 weeks, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas had likewise seceded from the Union. This left a crisis, of course, in the government, because it was not known exactly what could be done or what should be done for those concerning those federal troops that still remain below the Mason-Dixon line, troops such as at Fort Sumter in South Carolina. We have 2 more slides I think we'd like to show at this time. I believe the next one will... Okay, this is a grave with a man by the name of Parker slain in the raid of Harper's Ferry, was buried. The prettiest pictures you saw was his home. Let's go to the next slide. This particular slide, these slides are reproductions of actual photographs that were taken during the Civil War period. This one, of course, of Abraham Lincoln when he was elected President of the United States. And this gentleman that you see here with his family, of course, is Jefferson Davis. He was appointed as the President of the Confederacy, and he was a graduate of Transylvania University in Lexington, Kentucky. A school, of course, that was operated by the Church of Christ at that particular time. Okay, I guess that's all the slides we'll need for a while then. You can either leave that on or turn it off. In January 1861, Buchanan, during his final days as president, determined to send supplies on a vessel known as the Star of the West to Charleston, South Carolina, to relieve Major Anderson, the commander of Fort Sumter. But as the ship approached the fort, it was fired upon by Southern batteries, and the ship turned back. This was almost an open sign of hostility, but yet Buchanan, because he was at this time a lame duck president, simply ignored this open hostility and left the problem up to Abraham Lincoln, the incoming president of the South. Other forts in the South were forced to surrender. On April 12, 1861, Lincoln received an appeal from Major Anderson saying that he would need help to maintain the fort in Charleston. And Lincoln met with his cabinet and determined upon their advice to send relief, and so informed the South ahead of time that he was sending a relief ship to supply the federal troops at Fort Sumter. Confederate forces immediately then called upon Anderson to surrender, And when he refused to do this, they fired on Fort Sumter, and the Civil War began. Lincoln activated the militia and sent them, of course, into battle against the Southern forces. What was the reaction of religion in America to the advent of the Civil War? Even before the time of the beginning of the Civil War, most of the great denominational bodies, 3 out of the 4 major religious bodies in America, had already divided over the slavery issue. The first to divide in the year 1844, at the close of 1844 and the beginning of 1845, was the Methodist Episcopal Church. This divided on the slavery issue, with the Southern Methodists forming their own group and withdrawing from the Methodist Episcopal Church. This was followed in the year 1845 by the Baptist churches. So we have Southern Baptists and Northern Baptists today. And in 1857, the New Light Presbyterians likewise divided north and south, and this was followed in the year 1861, the beginning year of the war, by the Old Light Presbyterians. In Sweet's book on Religion in America, he talks about a man by the name of John C. Calhoun. It should be familiar to you. Said in the last formal speech made by John C. Calhoun in the United States Senate in the great debate over the Compromise of 1850, he stated, "The cords which bind the states together are not only many but various in character. Some are spiritual or ecclesiastical, some political, others social. Of these cords, the strongest are those of a religious nature, and they have begun to snap. In the powerful Methodist Episcopal Church, the numerous and strong ties which held it together are all broken, and its unity gone. Instead of one church, there are now 2 hostile bodies. The next cord that snapped was that of the Baptists, one of the largest and most respectable denominations. That of the Presbyterians is not entirely snapped, but some of its strands have given way. The Episcopal Church is the only one of the 4 great Protestant denominations which remain unbroken and entire. It was the explosive force of slavery agitation which broke these cords." And he stated, "If the agitation goes on, every cord will snap, political and social as well as ecclesiastical, and then there will be nothing to hold the states together except force." The snapping of the ecclesiastical cords had undoubtedly a large influence in creating the final breach between North and South. Indeed, there are good arguments to support the claim that the split of the churches was not only the first break between the sections, but the chief cause of the final break. In other words, what Sweet is saying is, if the churches could have held together, the nation would have held together. But because religious men became politically involved in the issues of their day, these churches led to the ultimate division, sectional division of all of these major religious bodies. War fever was everywhere at this particular time, even among the brethren of Jesus Christ. In the year 1860 and 1861, Tolbert Fanning, a leader in the church in Nashville, was on a tour of the South. And we read concerning this tour in the Church for the Ancient Order. I'd like to share just a few things with you from this particular volume. It says, from the time of Lincoln's election in November of 1860 until the guns sounded at Fort Sumter in April 1861, there was intense excitement, the like of which was never seen in the land before. During this period, Tolbert Fanning was on a journey through Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, and Georgia. Leaving Nashville at 6 o'clock on the evening of November 27th, he went to Corinth, Mississippi, and then on down to Jackson, the capital of the state. The Mississippi State Legislature was then in session, and Fanning confesses that while he thought on other occasions that he had seen political excitement, now he knew that he really hadn't. He went into the legislative halls and heard the speeches of Mississippi's Southern orators. The only question before them was, when and how shall Mississippi secede from the Union? Significant enough, the veteran preacher of the South, P.W. Caskey, was among the number chosen to draw up the document of secession and present it to the legislature. What a difference this spirit of war made in the church. 14 years before, Fanning had preached in Jackson to audiences that nearly filled the chamber of the House of Representatives in the State House. Now he preached for 2 days, and the audiences were very small. He talks about going on to other areas of the South, to Vicksburg and then to New Orleans. His searches revealed only 2 or 3 Christians worshiping after the New Testament order. From New Orleans, he went to Mobile, Alabama, and from there visited brethren throughout the state. Arriving in Montgomery, the capital of the state, he found the city in such a turmoil that no one had time or thought about the Lord. No brethren could be found, so Fanning went on to Atlanta, Georgia. He arrived here December 21st. He visited the home of Dr. A.G. Thomas, but was disappointed. Fanning said, Dr. A.G. Thomas is a brother of fine address, superior talents and learning, but we saw him with a feather in his hat and a glittering sword in his right hand, and doubted if he would be able to hold the sword of Georgia in one hand and the sword of the Spirit in the other. At the same time that Tober Fanning was making a tour of the South, Alexander Campbell was making a tour of the North. He was in the state of Indiana speaking, and while there he was joined by Isaac Eric, who had become a co-editor at that time of the Millennial Harbinger, and was also to become an agent for Bethany College to raise funds for the school. And so both continued throughout their journey together throughout the state of Indiana, but similar conditions were found as was found among the churches of the South. As we said, war fever was everywhere. And finally, after Alexander Campbell returned home, Isaac Eric continued on a tour of the state of Virginia. And we're told that after he took this extended tour of the state of Virginia, specifically in interest of Bethany College, that Eric had little success on this particular tour. The excitement of war was too great. Dispatches were passing between Washington and Fort Sumter, and hourly men were expecting the worst. Then came the news of Anderson's surrender, that is, of the fort. Madness ruled the hour as men in the South feverishly cursed the North, and those in the North did the same to the South. Eric prepared to leave Virginia at once, and on his return trip to Detroit, passed through Washington, D.C., Wheeling, Cleveland, before arriving at home. Every town, large and small, was filled with shouting, milling people. Flags were unfurled in the breeze. Banners were streamed across public places. Shouting and hurrahing, screaming were heard everywhere. No man could possibly describe the excitement then heard over the nation. W.H. Hobson, one of the great preaching orators of the Brethren, was in a meeting at 8th and Walnut Street in Cincinnati, Ohio at the time. The meeting had begun on April the 5th in 1861. And of course, the fall of Fort Sumter took place not long after the meeting had gotten underway. And actually this brought a close to the meeting. A member of the church at the time was mayor of the city of Cincinnati. And Hobson went on a ride with a buggy with him throughout the streets of Cincinnati as war fever broke out in the streets, and they agreed that the meeting would have to be closed. There was simply no time to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ, where children of peace their land at war. What position did Restoration leaders take concerning the war, the Civil War that had erupted? I think we have to go back to the beginning and recognize that Alexander Campbell took a strong stand against warfare long before the outbreak of the Civil War. In fact, in the first issue of the Christian Baptist in the year 1823, Alexander Campbell wrote these words. I think we have one slide we'd like to show you at this time. Let's have the next slide. He said, "And stranger still, see that Christian general with his 10,000 soldiers and his chaplain at his elbow, preaching, as he says, the gospel of goodwill among men, and hear him exhort his general and his Christian warriors to go forth with the Bible in one hand and the sword in the other, to fight the battles of God and their country, praying that the Lord will cause them to fight valiantly, and render their efforts successful in making as many widows and orphans as will afford sufficient opportunity for others to manifest the purity of their religion by taking care of them. If anything be wanting to finish a picture of the most glaring inconsistencies, add to this those Christians who are daily extolling the blessings of civil and religious liberty, and at the same time, by a system of most cruel oppression, separating the wife from the embraces of her husband, and the mother from her tender offspring, violating every principle and rending every tie that endears life and reconciles man to his lot, and that, forsooth, because might gives right. And a man is held guilty because his skin is a shade darker than the standard color of the time, averting to these signs of the times and many others to which prophecy is now fulfilled." And then he quotes from 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 3 and 4. "There will be a time when they will not endure wholesome teaching, but having itching ears, they will, according to their own lust, heap up to themselves teachers, and from the truth indeed they will turn away their ears and be turned aside to fables." And then again from chapter 3, "This also know, that in latter days perilous times will come. For men will be self-lovers, money-lovers, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, ungrateful, unholy, without natural affection, covenant breakers, slanderers, having a form of godliness, but denying the power of it. Now from these turn away." Christian reader, remember this command, and from such turn away. Alexander Campbell had not only written this in the Christian Baptist, but before the Bethany Church he had also brought in the early years an address entitled An Address on War. And this was such a plain statement on why a Christian should not go forth to war, that in later years a senator from West Virginia had the Address on War of Alexander Campbell read into the congressional record, so that it would go down in the documents of this country as a biblical reason why nations should not go forth in war against nations. And of course, particularly, not only that warfare was evil, but that Christians partaking in warfare was unthinkable. In the year 1848, when the question of the Mexican War came about, during the war of this expansion, Alexander Campbell had given his address on war, concluding with these words: "The precepts of Christianity positively inhibit war." The next slide. In 1861, after the outbreak of hostilities, he wrote these words in the Millennial Harbinger in Volume 4 on June of 1861. He entitled the article "Wars and Rumors of War," and said in part, "Civilized America, civilized United States, boasting of a human and Christian paternity and fraternity, unsheathing your swords, discharging your cannon, boasting of your heathen brutality, gluttonously satiating your furious appetite for fraternal blood, caps the climax of all human inconsistencies inscribed on the blurred and moth-eaten pages of time in all its records. If I view this slide, which was taken during the Civil War, with an ambulance corps simply picking up soldiers who died upon the battlefield, I think of one of the bloodiest battles that took place during the Civil War, the bloodiest battle. It took place again near where I grew up as a young boy at Antietam Battlefield in Sharpsburg, Maryland. Here on one day, 23,000 soldiers were killed or wounded. In comparison to that, during the Second World War, one of the bloodiest fights of the Second World War, the Normandy invasion of France, only 6,000 American soldiers were killed and wounded. It's hard to imagine or even to realize with only the armaments that they had at that particular time, that war could be such a devastating thing. As you look over those pastoral fields, the rolling green hillside of Sharpsburg, Maryland today, you could hardly imagine the bloody conflict that went forward there. In 1864, in the preface to the Millennial Harbinger of that year, the aging and failing old spiritual warrior, Alexander Campbell, wrote, "Many seem to have passed, we trust, but for time, under the power of the world, and to have forgotten the spirit and service of the gospel. The times are full of corruption, and the church is contaminated with the times. We all need to be reminded in tones of tenderness, coming as from a world renouncing agonies of the cross, that we, the people of the living God, are not of this world. Brethren, we are in the midst of appalling tokens of this very defection. And who is faithful and fearless? Shall we see our long labors go down in the storm of an hour, and give ourselves and our sacred charge without an effort or a struggle up to the devouring elements? Shall we forget this ourselves, or fail from false policy or treasonable cowardice to warn and to admonish those whom we see departing from this only legitimate work of our high and noble calling? Who are the faithful ones that stand ready to hold up our hands in this work? Our present volume asks this question and holds out its hands for an answer. Here's a man who's in the twilight of his years. Within 2 years, Alexander Campbell will be in the grave. The movement he endeavored to bring about here in America, at this time he thought had entered one of its darkest hours, in which he could see that political events had influenced the lives of Christians far above the influence of Jesus Christ their Savior and the gospel message that they were to proclaim. He called upon the fearless and those who were not cowards to stand up and be counted, and to maintain the purity of the gospel and stand above the conflicts of the world, to proclaim the gospel of peace in the land that was at war. Martin W. Stone died in the year 1844. But he was strongly against warfare and slavery as early as 1827, and wrote in the Christian Messenger that war and slavery were the greatest evils in the world. But he lived to see the start of the Mexican War, and sort of was opposed to that. Walter Scott, who had taken a neutralist position during the Mexican War, however, strongly felt that the Unionist cause was essential, therefore had taken a militant stand. The only one of the pioneer preachers to actually do so. Probably had Walter Scott also lived throughout the conflict, he may have taken a different look as the warriors approached. Other leaders who took a position against war were those who were the co-editors with Alexander Campbell, the Millennial Harbinger. Throughout the war, under Pendleton and Richardson, Millennial Harbinger continued to offer guidance to the church that they should not become involved in the political warfare that encased the nation. Benjamin Franklin, the preacher, and the American Christian Review, a paper probably by this time the most popular journal among the Christians, also took a very strong and vigorous stand against the war. James W. McGarvey, one of the great leaders of the Restoration Movement, probably one of its greatest writers and teachers, was most vigorously opposed to the war. And he wrote as follows, and I think we have one more slide, just kind of set the background to these words. I know not what course other preachers are going to pursue, for they have not spoken, but my own duty is now clear and my policy is fixed. I shall vote when called upon according to my views of political policy, and whether I remain a citizen of this Union or become a citizen of the Southern Confederacy. If the demon of war is let loose in the land, I shall proclaim to my brethren the peaceable commandments of my Savior, and strain every nerve to prevent them from joining any sort of military company or making any warlike preparation at all. I know that this course will be unpopular with the men of the world, and especially with political and military leaders, and there are some who might style it treason. But I would rather 10,000 times be killed for refusing to fight than to fall in battle or to come home victorious with the blood of my brethren on my hands. There were Christians, both north and south. McGarvey not only felt very strongly about the evils of warfare, but how precious would it be for one Christian brother to take up a sword against another Christian brother. During the war years, it's interesting to note that from 1861 to 1863, James W. McGarvey was involved in writing his commentary on the book of Acts. Simply, if you guys want to go through it, go ahead. I'm going to write my commentary. He was called upon to return from Missouri, where he was writing his commentary on Acts, to come and save the church at Lexington from division. James W. McGarvey became the preacher there and did preserve the Lexington church from dividing over the issues of slavery and warfare. Other men who were leaders at this particular time in the pacifist effort within the church were men like T.P. Haley and H.A. Haley, or H.H. Haley rather. Jacob Creek Jr., who was a preacher in Missouri at this particular time, and had so much great influence in the early times of the Restoration Movement. And during these war years, we're told of one instance where he went out into the woods, which was very common for him to do, behind his farm, and there knelt down by a tree stump and began to pray. Unbeknownst to him, there was a group of Union forces who had captured some Confederate soldiers. Were going to take their lives right at that time. But they were so affected by the prayer of Jacob Creek that they refused to do that. Tremendous testimony to this particular man. Other men who were influential were B.H. and B.K. Smith, a man by the name of J.J. Everest, T.M. Allen, one of the great pioneer preachers in Kentucky, Moses E. Lard, another Missouri preacher who became and will become increasingly important as a second-generation leader in the Restoration movement. Robert Milligan, who later served as a professor at Transylvania University. Eilert Rains, one of the very early pioneers, along with Philip Claw and Alexander Proctor. The work of Tobert Fanning and David Lipscomb, together working among the Tennessee Brethren, are probably responsible in their combined efforts of keeping the churches and many of the Christians out of the war in Tennessee. In fact, they petitioned the Confederacy and Jefferson Davis, its president, to allow the Christians simply to remain out of the conflict. And many of the Tennessee churches, of course, were influenced by their efforts. However, whether north or south, we must recognize the fact that not all were committed to a biblical position with regard to warfare. But there were many, both north and south, who took up arms and went forth into battle. Opposition to warfare pretty much rested within the border states of Kentucky, Tennessee, Virginia, and Missouri. When you go into the deep south, almost to men, and sometimes whole churches entered into the conflict, as well as when you go further into the north. And so we have probably a second group of people that we need to talk about tonight, and that is the pro-war group. This was led in the South by James Shannon, whom we discussed Sunday night in our message on slavery. An avid pro-slavery individual and one who promoted conflict in his stay in Missouri. W.H. Hobson, the man that we talked about just a little while ago, holding the meeting in Cincinnati, became a chaplain in the Southern Army. C.W. Caskey and B.F. Hall, both became leaders in the Confederate Army. One of the great books that was probably written during of Restoration history was a book, let's see if I can find my quotation here. It was a book written by William Baxter entitled Peerage and Prairie Grove. And it, more than probably any other book, has painted what it was actually like in the South during the days of the Civil War for the church. It says a number of the most prominent disciple preachers in the South supported the war. John G. Parrish, George W. Abel, and late in the war, Winthrop Hobson preached among the Army of Northern Virginia, although none of them, he says, was a chaplain. The two most colorful disciples, Confederate chaplains, were Benjamin F. Hall and Thomas W. Caskey. Hall, a chaplain of Barton W. Stone, Jr.'s regiment of the 6th Texas Cavalry, was immortalized in William Baxter's Pea Ridge and Prairie Grove. It's interesting to note that even though Barton W. Stone and Alexander Campbell both took a position against Christians participating in warfare, that both had sons that entered into the conflict. Sometimes that's hard to explain, but it shows that the devil certainly works in the world, no matter how and what training we give to our children. Sometimes they do not always do what we would like to have them to do. So it was with both Barton W. Stone and Alexander Campbell. Baxter and Robert Graham, disciples preachers who had been operating a college in Fayetteville, Arkansas, visited Hall when his unruly outfit passed through his village shortly after the opening of the war. Baxter wrote of this visit, "I had known him in former years and was not prepared for the change, which a few hours' intercourse was sufficient to convince me had taken place. He boasted of his trusty rifle, of the accuracy of his aim, and doubted not that the weapon with which he claimed to have killed deer at 200 yards would be quite as effectual when he when a Yankee was the mark. I ventured to ask what his views concerning his brethren, what were his views concerning his brethren with and for whom he had labored over the years in both North and West. He replied that they were no brethren of his, that the religionists of the other side of the line were all infidels, and that true religion was now only to be found in the South. Once during the evening he wished that the people of the North were upon one vast platform with a magazine of powder beneath, and that he might have the pleasure of applying the match to hurl them all into eternity. Elder Graham was a man of fine social qualities, gifted in conversation and repartee, but that evening he was speechless. To argue was not only useless but dangerous, and we prudently said but little in reply. War changes men and their thinking. Man who once proclaimed a message concerning the Prince of Peace now found himself wishing that he could blow everyone who favored the cause of the North into eternity with one match. In the North, James A. Garfield, who had been president of Hiram College, where my father graduated, went off to war, enlisting a regiment after having received the commission from the governor of Ohio as a colonel. Not only went off to war, but to fame, and later to political ambition, and finally ended up as the first president of the United States, to be numbered among the followers of the Restoration movement. Isaac Errett likewise applied for commission in the Northern Army, but was refused because all the commissions had been given out. He became a chaplain. His brother, J.W., became a major in the Union forces. W.T. Moore, who later became a liberal leader among the disciples of Christ, likewise enlisted in the Union forces. L.L. Pinkerton, and if you've ever heard of Pinkerton's detective agency, you know where it came from. Had been one of the liberal leaders in Kentucky, is credited with as being the first man to introduce an organ into the church. Also took up the Union's cause, as well as D.S. Burnett, the founder of the American Christian Missionary Society. Of course, the Christian Missionary Society, the group that split off over the slavery question during these early years of the war, its leaders, Ovid Butler and Gage, who had edited the Northwest Christian magazine, likewise became leaders in the Union conflict. And of course, there were others on the side of the South as well, as we've already noted. One of the things that developed during the war period that became an important thing as far as the eventual division that took place within the church here in America involved the Missionary Society, which had been given birth, as you remember, in the year 1849. Elijah Goodwin, who at this time was editor of the Christian Record, published in Indianapolis, began a weekly column in 1862 to counteract the influences of the American Christian Review. In the Quest for a Christian America, David Edwin Harold says, "Now who can be neutral of this awful subject? While this tremendous struggle is in progress, the man who will not define his position and let his contemporaries know where he stands is justly suspected by every true patriot and should be watched. For he that is not for us is against us. It is impossible for any man in these trying times to be neutral in fact. He may talk neutrality, but in his heart he sympathizes with the rebellion." This was a position that was taken by Elijah Goodwin. B.J. Harrison Jones became a chaplain in Garfield's outfit and became the Army correspondent for the Christian Record. And weekly, as the paper came out, included a review of the events as they were transpiring during the war. In the 1861 convention of the American Christian Missionary Society, Garfield and other Union men attended in full uniform. And there was a loyalty resolution that was submitted at this particular time. The Christian Missionary Society had promised to disband if the American Christian Missionary Society would pass such a resolution strongly supporting the Union and the war effort on the side of the North. John P. Robertson of Bedford, Ohio, submitted the following resolution: Resolved that we deeply sympathize with the loyal and patriotic in our country in the present efforts to sustain the government of the United States, and we feel it our duty as Christians to ask our brethren everywhere to do all in their power to sustain the proper and constitutional authorities of the Union. This was seconded by L.L. Pinkerton. D.S. Burnett then challenged the constitutionality of such a resolution, since the Missionary Society had been founded not for the purpose of making resolutions concerning political situations, but rather to spread the gospel of Jesus Christ. Isaac Errett, who was presiding at this particular meeting, ruled that it was constitutional. This ruling was appealed by the old warrior Raccoon John Smith. But then later his appeal was or the resolution was withdrawn after Raccoon John Smith's appeal. A man by the name of Richard M. Bishop then re-entered the appeal and was sustained by a vote of the convention. By prearrangement, L.L. Pinkerton called for a 10-minute recess. What had taken place here on the floor then was a maneuvering concerning whether it was right to have the resolution or not. The constitutionality of it was challenged, ruled by the presiding man, Isaac Errett, to be constitutional. This ruling, however, was appealed and then was overthrown. And immediately L.L. Pinkerton then called for recess. After 10 minutes, the convention reconvened, and D.S. Burnett was now in the chair instead of Isaac Errett. Robertson's resolution was again introduced, and after a speech by James A. Garfield, it was passed with just one no vote. The opposition considered this an illegal move, since they had already made that determination in the full body of the convention before the recess. Therefore, it wasn't even protested. Later, when Benjamin Franklin wrote about this in the Christian Review, he simply called the second convening and the offering of the resolution the second time and its passing simply a farce. But this was not, therefore, was not held to be binding, really, by many. And so in the 1862 convention, there was determination upon the part of the pro-Union forces to see that a stronger resolution was passed. Benjamin Franklin, in the meantime, in the course of the intervening years, tried to rally the neutralist forces against the passage of such a measure. At the convention, an exchange developed between D.S. Burnett and James W. McGarvey. Elijah Goodwin read a report using the words "subjection to powers that be" as an argument in favor of the fact that they ought to go to war, that in fact Christians ought to favor warfare. On the other hand, James W. McGarvey got up and read a report from the Kentucky State Convention condemning those brethren who practiced in the war. And so no resolution was passed in 1862. But in 1863, at the convention, Randall Park made this following resolution: Whereas there is no power but of God, and the powers that be are ordained of God, and whereas we are commanded in the Holy Scriptures to be subject to the powers that be, and obey magistrates, and whereas an armed rebellion exists in our country, subvertive of these divine injunctions, and whereas reports have gone abroad that we as a religious body, and particularly as a missionary society, are to a certain degree disloyal to the government of the United States, therefore, be it resolved that we unqualifyingly declare our allegiance to said government and repudiate as false and slanderous any statements to the contrary. We further resolve that we tender our sympathies to our brave and noble soldiers in the field who are defending us from the attempt of armed traitors and the overthrow of our government, and also to those bereaved and rendered desolate by the ravages of war. Resolve that we will earnestly and constantly pray to God to give our legislatures and rulers wisdom to enact and power to execute such laws or as will speedily bring to us the enjoyment of a peace that God will design and bless. So this particular resolution was presented before the convention. This led to a certain amount of confusion on the floor. A move to adjourn was defeated, and there was a call for ruling once again concerning the constitutionality of such a resolution. Isaac Errett, who was again in charge of the convention, said that it was ruled unconstitutional 2 years ago, but that he did not agree with that. Therefore, once again, another move for adjournment was defeated, and the resolution was finally passed. The immediate effect of this was that the Christian Missionary Society was dissolved, and they ceased to exist, so that there was no competing missionary society with American Christian Missionary Society. As we had already learned, this group had been organized at Northwestern Christian University, later called Butler University, was a pro-slavery group, and in fact a radical pro-slavery group within the church. James W. McGarvey had this statement to make after the convention: "The passage of the resolutions was a stunning blow for the neutralists. Immediately after the close of the convention, Benjamin Franklin wrote, 'We do not feel as full of hope for the society as we had done on some former occasions.'" In the eyes of James W. McGarvey, he felt that the society had actually died. Franklin predicted that the society had almost certainly ruined its future usefulness, especially in the South and among the border states. The most ferocious attack on the society, however, had come from the powerful Lexington preacher. McGarvey said, "I have judged the American Christian Missionary Society and have decided for myself that it should now cease to exist." McGarvey insisted that the society had permanently estranged a large segment of the brotherhood by its action, and if it continued to exist, it would be a source of untold trouble. The influential Kentucky pacifist article ripped wide open the festering sores of sectional bitterness. Opposition to the society spread throughout Kentucky. Eilert Raines tersely scribbled in his diary, which he was a constant keeper of, "Brother McGarvey has taken the position that the American Christian Missionary Society is dead." What about the long-range effects that the war had upon the church? Well, first of all, it brought into being the Christian Standard. In the year 1866, following the war, many of the war leaders were concerned over the fact that the millennial harbinger, Alexander Campbell, had died, and that the American Christian Review under Benjamin Franklin was now the leading journal read among the Christians. And they were concerned that because of his conservatism and his anti-war position and anti-missionary society position, that there was a need for a journal who could espouse the concepts of these leaders. Sectionalism had split the Restoration into three areas: North, South, and Middle States. 1866 also brought about the rebirth of the Gospel Advocate in Nashville, Tennessee, again under the leadership of Tolbert Fanning and the editorship of a man by the name of David Lipscomb. From this time onward, the Advocate became the voice of the South, and the Christian Standard became the Advocate of the North. Could the church divide? Moses Lord, in the year 1866, felt that it could not really divide. But no one paper any longer existed that had the influence that the Millennial Harbinger had had. No longer could one paper dominate the thinking of the Brotherhood. And Northern liberals had taken over much of the movement by this time. They had set the course for the liberal and the social gospel to be preached. They had moved away from strict biblical interpretation. The moderates had, in all reality, lost control of the situation. David Harold says, in the final analysis, the critical weakness of the disciples of Christ in 1866, as far as maintaining unity was concerned, was that the moderates lost control. A large group of moderates remained in the church at the close of the war, largely in the border areas. These men, representing much of the common heritage of the movement, men who were both sectarian and denominational. And you have to understand this in the light of what the man is writing. He's writing from a sociological standpoint, and the word sectarian or denominational does not have the same meaning in a sociological context as it would to our minds today. What he's saying simply is this, that the position taken of a definite biblical stand which set them apart as what the world would call a sect had been lost, this ground, this middle ground. Opposed to political fervor and yet not opposed to Christians participating in politics, unwilling to join the national struggle, but willing to forgive both Northerners and Southerners. But there was not enough of them left. In fact, strife and had fattened the fanatical fringes of the movement into sizable and obstinate factions. Certainly not all disciples became conservatives or liberals because of where they lived. There continued to be liberals in the South and conservatives in the North, and middle-of-the-roaders everywhere. But sectional animosities were an important, persistent force in the future course of the church. But if the Civil War is, in the history of the disciples, as in the history of American Protestantism, one of the most obvious examples of the subservience of the church to social forces, it also is a striking example of the unbending and uncompromising spirit of militant Christianity standing against the forces of social conformity. Scattered prophets in all sections, led by the fading but courageous Alexander Campbell, fearlessly raised their voices in Christian protest against the madness of their kinsmen and brethren. As a body, the disciples valiantly resisted involvement in the Holocaust. Had the struggle been shorter, they might have succeeded. You cannot help but recognize the fact that something as grave a social crisis as the Civil War, which could divide a nation and pit relative against relative, would certainly have its effect even upon those who are in the Lord's church. We can see that people were pretty much people, just as they are today. Those who want to stand for God and are willing to stand regardless of the problem or the crisis, even though it's deep and divisive, will continue to stand for God regardless, because they build their faith upon God's Word. And what God has said is important to their minds and souls. To others, it will simply matter that the things that we're going